Good afternoon and welcome to Democracy in the 2024 election. I'm Matt Hall. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department and the director of the Bruni Center for the Study of American Democracy. Back in grad school, I discovered that my job comes with an unusual occupational hazard. Anytime a stranger asks what I do, if I decide to tell the truth, I find myself in a conversation about politics with a total stranger. And these conversations always kind of go the same way. Everyone starts with, oh, this is such an interesting time to be studying politics. What with everything crazy going on? They do this, by the way, every single year, regardless of what's going on. It doesn't matter. And I feel the need to explain to them most of the time, no, this is actually not particularly unusual. Despite what you might have heard on cable news, the world is not coming to an end. This is not the craziest time ever in American politics. And the next random midterm election is not the most important election in American history. Every time I have this conversation, I can't help but think of Robert Kennedy's speech a few years before he was assassinated, in which he related an old Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times," and really lamented the fact that the 1960s, they were living through one of those interesting times. Kennedy actually ripped that off from another politician, Austin Chamberlain, who in the years leading up to World War II said that they were under that same curse, living in interesting times. Turns out the whole Chinese curse thing is completely apocryphal. No such thing in China. It actually can be traced back to that British politician's own father, who in the 1890s gave a speech describing that period as interesting times in which each new day brings new objects of interest and new objects of anxiety. It's been 130 years, and man, can I relate to that. In objects of anxiety. In an era where we're experiencing intense partisan polarization, widespread disinformation, shocking acts of political violence, and even attempted political assassinations, I'm sorry to report we are indeed living in interesting times. But have no fear, because there's a panel to help alleviate our collective level of anxiety with a series of experts in these interesting times. We're joined today by Pulitzer Prize winner and New York Times columnist Carlos Lozada, former editor-in-chief and current editor-at-large for the Wall Street Journal, Gerard Baker, the Reverend, I messed up your title, the distinguished Professor Reverend C.C. Lewis, distinguished professor of political science, Diane Pinderhughes, and the namesake of the Bruni Center, former congressman and ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. And of course, our moderator, Dean Cole of the law school. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much for the introductions, Matt, and I'm grateful to be here to put questions to our panel about American democracy and the 2024 election. And I want to start by suggesting that Americans have probably learned more about the Electoral College over the last 4 years than they ever learned in school. And so now we're in a situation where states are solidly red or solidly blue. And the election of the President of the United States really comes down to just 7 swing states. And in fact, I don't think it's outlandish to suggest that the people of Pennsylvania will be electing the President of the United States this year. What do we do about this? Should we revisit campaign finance law so that people living in California who basically their votes don't really count if California is not in play, should they be allowed to give beyond the limits to candidates running in Pennsylvania? I'll put it to any, Carlos.
Sure. Any of you? Me? Okay. First of all, thank you for having me, for having all of us here. I understand and applaud the impetus behind the question. Anything that allows for enhanced participation in the democratic system, especially the electoral system, I think is vital. I'd be somewhat hesitant about that particular approach to it. I think it might be something that addresses symptoms more than causes, right? If you're worried about voters in other states that are not Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, right, the 7, being disenfranchised, then maybe we do something about that, rather than allowing people to inject more money into those same states, right? I suspect that it might sort of aggravate the problem. If the Electoral College is the issue, if the way we elect senators is the issue, then I think let's explore those questions. The voters, I don't know, actually necessarily want to have more money in politics. Pew has done some research on this, and they find that a majority of voters think there's too much money in politics. They actually want there to be less money in politics. And so if we want to be responsive to voters, we might be responsive to that sort of impulse on their part as well. The last thing, and here I hesitate speaking in front of a law school dean, but the Supreme Court, it seems to me, has done plenty to allow for additional money in politics, not just the Citizens United case, but more recently the McCutcheon case, which removed limits on aggregate contributions. And so it seems even with those changes, we still face the issue, the challenge that you started.
So let me ask you, Jared, do you think that the Electoral College, as Carlos mentioned, is the thing that's disenfranchising people in the 43 states that are not?
Thank you, Dean Cole. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. You can tell from my accent I'm not from these parts. Although I have lived in the United States for more than 30 years now, and I love coming to Notre Dame. My principal connection here is that I have 5 daughters, 3 of whom have graduated from Notre Dame. One of whom is currently a sophomore. She did promise to be here this afternoon, but apparently Friday afternoon, football weekend, she had better things to do. Who knew? But I think I agree with Carlos. I think doing anything that actually further facilitates the infusion of large amounts of money into US elections is probably not a good thing. And the Electoral College, look, the Electoral, as you say, Dean, the Electoral College has become controversial in the last few years. I was in Florida in 2020 when we had the extraordinary Bush v. Gore runoff after the election, as it were, which went on for 5 weeks. Of course, that was what was so striking about that election. Of course, remember that was Gore won slightly more of the popular vote than Bush, and thanks to a 500 margin vote in Florida, Bush won the election. And everybody at the time was thinking, my God, this is a freak. We never have elections like this again. So close, and where one candidate wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College. Well, I would say, dare to say, with so much of American life, the freak has become the norm. Now we have these extraordinarily close elections, time after time after time, which create not only political dissatisfaction, but obviously legal questions and challenges. I was reading recently about Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin, after a power struggle after Joseph Stalin, some of which, if you haven't seen the Death of Stalin movie, I advise you to look at it to give you a little bit of a taste of what went on. Khrushchev was leader of the Soviet Union for 10 years, almost 10 years, and in the context of talking about the differences between Western democracy and Soviet democracy, as they called it, he said, the real problem with free elections that you have is that nobody knows who's going to win them. And as I was reading that, I was struck and I thought, actually, no, you know what, America has actually taken that a stage further now, because not only in this country do we not know who's going to win an election before it's taken place, we don't actually know who's won an election after it's happened. So look, I think I do understand the concerns about the Electoral College, and by the way, if we get another election, this would be, it is remarkable. If Trump would win in November, it would be, I think that's right, it would be and not win the popular vote. If he won the Electoral College and not the popular vote, it would be the 6th time in 7 elections that Democrats have won the popular vote. And it will be the 3rd time, third out of 3 of those occasions when they've been beaten in the Electoral College. So I do understand the concerns about, look, but what I would say, there are a number of reforms you could make. You could make the allocation of votes in the Electoral College by each state proportionate to the state's votes. You could do what 2 states currently do, which is to divide the electoral vote up by congressional districts. There are reforms you can make if you want to. The only thing I'd say in defence of the Electoral College, and it is becoming harder and harder to defend, I think, for a lot of people, is, look, it was set up, we can argue about the reasons it was set up, but it does reflect the federalism of the United States. The founders were very keen to ensure that this was not a single unitary polity, but that it had reflected the various cultures, political cultures and characters, and indeed the autonomy of the various constituent states. And that is why that's why the Electoral College is formed as it is, with that, obviously because of it's tied to the representation in Congress, it significantly overrepresents small states and underrepresents the larger states. So I think there is something about, while I understand the concerns about the Electoral College, there is something still, I think, it's worth reflecting on what makes many of the things that have made America so successful and so stable for 240 years. And I think one of those things is the federalist system, is the fact, again, I come from Britain where there is no federalism. Britain's a whole unitary state and it's created its own problems as a result. So I think if you were going to, I think you should reflect on the advantages that the Electoral College represents, as well as the demerits of it.
Professor Diane Pendergrass, is the Electoral College the problem?
Well, there are a lot of problems. I guess I would say that your initial question about should we invite the issue of campaign contribution limits to enable Americans to get more involved in elections. My first reaction to that, your question, was yes, but tell that to the Supreme Court. The court has not been willing to put any constraints on spending. So that's one element. The Electoral College is a problem in the sense that the overrepresentation is, as Jerry just mentioned, which means that the representation of the millions of people in California is ignored. And the representation in many other larger states that include more representation by people of color, by African Americans, by New York, California, the southern states, tend not to get represented in the same way that they might if the representation was proportional. So the Electoral College creates a system of power that advantages the smallest portions of the population.
So, but I think the response to that might be that 1 out of every 9 Americans is a Californian, and if we eliminated the Electoral College, we'd all be Californians. California, right?
As opposed to by Pennsylvania?
Ambassador Rooney, so you served in Congress. What are your thoughts about the role of the Electoral College in these elections?
I think the Electoral College is doing exactly what the founders set it up to do. And I think it's important in our separation of powers and our system of protecting the big from the small from the big, that we allow it to function the way that it is. Otherwise, you're going to have California, Chicago, and New York elect everybody. And I don't think American people deserve that. And I don't think that stands for either. With that said, on campaign finance, I have some time invested in that, and it is absolutely a problem. When I was on George Bush's finance team with another gentleman in this room, our budget in 2004 was $164 million. Well, it's in the paper this week that both Ohio and Pennsylvania, Ohio and Michigan are going to spend almost $300 million in their Senate campaign. And Dave McCormick told me that he expects them to spend $400 between him and Casey in Pennsylvania. So something's dreadfully wrong. And it's empowering a bunch of lobbyists and special interest people who exert an inordinate amount of influence on many of our legislators. And that's a real problem in and of itself. The other problem is non-disclosed contributions. You may not know this, but there's a section in the election law which allows you to give to a certain kind of PAC and not disclose what you gave. And I would be absolutely against that.
So you mentioned legislation legislators, I want to talk a little bit about state legislatures. And right now, I think we're witnessing in various states that are heavily one party or the other moves to affect the election process. So for example, in Georgia, we're seeing moves by a Republican legislature and a Republican governor to enact election law reforms that are arguably intended to suppress the vote, or some would argue that they're intended to make the vote more honest, to keep non-citizens from voting. Professor Pinderhughes, what do you think about these measures, and are they likely to succeed for Republicans, or has the influx of Northerners into southern states been so great that it overwhelms that move?
Well, there are a couple of bits of information I can share that, for example, in 2021, the Republican voting law changes were put in place to limit black voters. And some examples: limit the ability of the state election board and Secretary of State to enter into certain consent agreements, settlements, and consent orders. The Secretary of State shall be a non-voting ex officio member of the state election board, which in the past the Secretary of State has been a voting member. Revises provisions related to the quorum of such a board to require the Secretary of State to support and assist the state election board. A whole variety of things that have been intended to constrain the ability of election officials to operate in a nonpartisan fashion. Now that's 2021. There have been a number of other actions that have been taken since then that are even more aggressive to limit state election officials' abilities to protect the rights of people to vote. Whether or not the migration to the south from the north will make enough of a difference, people like Stacey Abrams' ability to create a number of voting rights organizations, whether she will be able to have an impact, whether the large number of black voters who have been migrating to the south will make a difference and will be able to counter some of these laws, is a very important question. I would guess that the effort of the Republican Party to, given the Republican governor, given the Republican election officials, to put constraints on those black voters, particularly black voters, but the black voters who are Democratic voters as well, will, I mean, that's a question for me. I think that I'd like to think there's some possibility that they'll be able to resist, but they've been working very hard at putting in restraints on the ability of voters to actually participate in a regular way. One example is the not giving voters water when they're standing in line, and Georgia has been known to be a state that voter registration, voter participation tends to produce very long times that people have to wait to vote. And we don't see that in many other states. So it's a question. I think it's a problem.
Is there a legitimate reason why these measures are being put in place? Is there an argument, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is. And I'll push back a little bit on what Professor says. I mean, for example, although those Georgia voting law changes that were made in 2021 were described by Democrats as, Jim Crow 2.0 and an effort to suppress black voting, it was striking that in the 2022 midterms, the first elections that took place under the new rules, the turnout was significantly higher, including among black voters. It was higher than it had ever, it was actually the highest I think it had ever been in a midterm election. Black voters voted in larger numbers than they voted in the previous midterm elections in 2018, 2014, depending on when the Senate race was. And of course, the African-American Democratic candidate won. Again, won actually by a slightly larger share of the vote than he won in 2020, when there was a special election for the same seat. So You know, and there are concerns about fraudulent registration, about voters being registered who are not residents. There were limited numbers of cases of that. As we know, Donald Trump made a big deal of it in Georgia about after the 2020 election. There was no significant evidence of widespread fraud. But I do think tightening some of the rules around voting, particularly around things like early voting, to minimise the risk of fraud. It's what, by the way, happens in almost every other country. Other countries do have rules about producing identity when you go to vote. You have certain, much more limited time frames in which to vote. In the 2020 election, or even in this election, as we know, early voting has already started. Mail-in balloting, which has become very, very widespread here, is notoriously susceptible to fraud. So I think actually there is a case for significantly tightening the rules around voting, particularly in an age which we just talked about, when there is so much controversy and so much doubt about the legitimacy of elections. And if you can do what you can do to make sure that people see that these elections are conducted legitimately, then you are going to limit the ability of people, when Donald Trump comes out and tries to say, actually, there was fraudulent voting. If you've taken very tough measures against fraudulent voting, you have a better chance, I think, of securing a higher level of confidence in the vote.
Carlos, do we have large measures of fraudulent voting across the United States?
I don't think that we do. I don't think that we've determined that. I always find it interesting when politicians say that they're merely responding to widespread concerns, when in fact they've often fostered those widespread concerns to begin with. And so that is something that you've seen in recent years. In Georgia, what you're seeing is not just legislative sort of change, laws taken up by the legislature. You're seeing the state election board much more recently introducing rules to the conduct of the election. For instance, and this is just in the last few weeks, the state election board in Georgia is now requiring county-level officials to do a manual count of all votes, not just the machine count. And that could delay the reporting of the results by several days. And if three independent poll workers don't produce the exact same count, then there has to be a sort of continuous recount. At the same time, they've allowed counties, county-level officials, to delay certification if they have cause to suspect irregularities. And of course, the uncertainties you're creating by introducing the manual count can create those concerns about irregularities. And coincidentally, 3 of the 5 officials are being on the State Board of Elections, sorry for all this detail, are being sort of name-checked by one of the major presidential candidates in his rallies, right? And so, those kind of things can foster in turn the kind of uncertainty that politicians say they're merely responding to, when often they are fostering that.
Ambassador Rooney, are we responding to a myth of widespread fraud, or is this a reality?
I have not seen, as the gentleman just said, any documentable, verifiable evidence of massive or widespread fraud. There's always a few in every state, bad ballots that aren't signed, et cetera, et cetera. But the issues that have been touched on here in Georgia are important for the whole United States. This business of hand counting ballots in the electronic age, delaying the completion of the process for as much as a week makes 0 sense to me. And I think it's going to create more uncertainty in the middle of a climate where uncertainty is not our friend. Stability and certainty are our friend. Now, I don't have any problem with ID to vote. All around the world, you have to have an ID to vote. In Mexico, they've got a picture of you there, and you go up, and they compare you to it, and you sign right under it, and your ID number has to match what they've got in their book. In Iraq, as you've probably seen on TV, they put the ink on your thumb and it won't go away for things. But we can make sure that the people that should vote get to vote. That's all you got to do.
Both Jerry and Van mentioned the black vote in Georgia, and by all reports, the black vote will be critically important in determining the outcome in Georgia. Are there other states where the black vote is going to make a difference in determining the outcome? Or are we just talking about Georgia and maybe North Carolina?
I mean, in a close election, obviously Georgia's, I think, the large, of the 7 swing states, I think does have the largest proportion of black voters. But in a close election, I mean, yes, the turnout in any group will matter. You know, the last elections, as you know, the last 2 elections were decided by, if 35,000 people in 3 or 4 states, I think it was in 2016, had voted for Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump, she would have won out of a total of 135 million votes cast. In 2020, 20,000 people had voted for Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden in just 3 states. He would have won out of 160 million cast. So these are the margins we're talking about. And if you look at the polling in the swing states insofar as it can be trusted, every single swing state, every one of those 7 key states that everybody's focused on, the margin is between 0.1 in favour of one candidate and 2.1 in favour of another candidate. So, yeah, well, Georgia, as I say, I think has the largest number of black voters in one of those states, but I would think in North Carolina will be quite significant. The northern states tend to have got fewer, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, fewer black voters, but it could, you know, these, when you have an election decided by a few thousand votes potentially in a few states, then every single facet of turnout, of electoral behaviour is potentially determinative.
Let me ask about another swing state, Arizona. So, in Arizona, recently, the state Supreme Court revived the enforceability of an 1864 abortion law that banned virtually all abortions. And that decision was met with an effort by the state legislature to overturn or repeal that law, as well as an effort to defeat 2 of the Supreme Court justices in a retention election. What role will the abortion debate play in Arizona? Carlos.
There's an interesting contrast there. Since the Dobbs ruling 2 years ago, you've seen state-level measures in support of abortion rights having a lot of success, even in states that you might otherwise think would lean more conservative, such as Kansas. And Arizona now has one which would enshrine sort of row-level protections for abortion rights moving forward. Yet Trump is up like 5 points or so in Arizona, depending on polls. Sometimes it's a little more narrow in others. When you look at the New York Times, sorry to be so parochial, at the New York Times Siena poll of swing states, you see that abortion rights are considered the top issue for about 18% of voters in Arizona. Below the economy, below the border, right? And so that may be part of the, that may help square that circle. What seems clear is that both presidential campaigns seem to have a similar theory of the case, right? It's a winning issue for Democrats, it's a losing issue for Republicans. And you see that because Kamala Harris is campaigning very actively on it.